I announced to my son that I was thinking about selling the lake house on a Sunday afternoon in early October, standing in the kitchen with the phone warm in my hand and the words already arranged before I dialed. I said I had been talking to a realtor. I said the upkeep was getting to be a lot for one man. I said I was not sure I needed a place that size anymore. What he said next, before he said anything else, was not a question about how I was doing or whether this was what I actually wanted. It was a question about timing. That question told me more than I had expected to learn that quickly, and what it told me sent me to the back porch with a cup of coffee that went cold, while I sat there thinking about the shape of what I had just heard. Welcome to True Family Story. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from. Let's get into it. My name is Raymond Hollis. I am 64 years old and I live in Brevard, North Carolina, which is a small mountain town in the western part of the state that most people have not heard of unless they have driven through it on the way to somewhere else and pulled over because the light was doing something to the ridgeline that they could not explain and did not want to drive away from. I have lived here for 31 years. My wife Dorothy and I moved from Raleigh in 1993 with 2 kids, a rented moving truck, and the specific kind of confidence that people have when they are young enough to confuse stubbornness with certainty. I built a carpentry and finished woodworking business out of a shop on Old Toxaway Road starting that first year. One man, a used table saw, and a client list that was for the first 2 years a single general contractor named Pete Osgood who gave me work out of what I later understood was kindness rather than necessity, because Pete had his own guys. But Pete had known my father and he believed in the principle of giving a man a fair start. By the time I sold the business in 2019, we had 11 employees, a reputation across 4 counties for millwork and custom cabinetry that nobody else in Western Carolina was doing at that level, and a shop that had grown 3 times and would have needed to grow again if I had stayed in it. The sale was good. I will not give you a number, but I will tell you it was enough. It was more than enough. Dorothy and I had talked about what enough looked like for years, specifically and practically the way she did everything, with a legal pad and a running list of questions she kept on the nightstand. One of those questions, circled twice in her handwriting, was, "When do we go to New Zealand?" Dorothy died in April of 2021. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that does not announce itself politely and does not give you the amount of time you need to say what you mean to say, though we said most of it anyway because Dorothy was not a woman who left things unsaid when saying them was still possible. She was 61 years old. We had been married for 36 years. She had never gotten to New Zealand. I want you to sit with that before I tell you anything else, because the rest of this story does not make full sense without understanding what it felt like to be Raymond Hollis in the fall of 2023. 2.5 years past the April morning, I came home to a house that still smelled like her coffee, and knew immediately that the particular weight of a home occupied by 2 people had shifted into something different and quieter, permanent. My son Carter is 39. He lives in Asheville, 40 minutes from Brevard, with his girlfriend Dana, and a life that from the outside looks exactly like the life of a man who has figured things out. He works in commercial real estate, has done well enough to own a condo in the River Arts District that he bought in 2020 when prices were still sane, and carries himself with the easy confidence of a person who has not yet been seriously tested by anything. Carter and I have always had a particular kind of relationship, the kind between fathers and sons who love each other without always knowing what to say to each other, who fill the space with sports and project talk and surface-level check-ins that are warm but not deep. Dorothy was the translator between us. She knew what Carter meant when he said things sideways, and she knew what I meant when I said less than I felt, and she moved between us, making the meaning clear without making either of us feel managed. After she died, the translation stopped. What Carter and I had in the 2 years after was functional and genuine in the basic sense, and not always fully honest underneath, in the way that 2 people who love each other sometimes aren't when the person who connected them is gone. My daughter Renee is 36. She lives in Raleigh, works in school administration, calls on Tuesday evenings, and came to Brevard for every holiday in the 2 years after Dorothy died, with the same quiet consistency that told me she was doing it because she wanted to be here, and not because she had calculated that she should be. Renee and Dorothy were close in the way that mothers and daughters are close, when the mother does not try to shape the daughter into anything, and the daughter therefore has nothing to push against. After Dorothy died, Renee and I became close in the way that people become close when they are both missing the same person, and have decided to say so out loud instead of managing around it. In the summer of 2023, something shifted. Not dramatically, and not all at once. Carter had always called irregularly, whenever something came up, which was fine and normal and not a pattern I read into. But starting in July, he was calling more frequently, twice in July, 3 times in August. The calls themselves were not unusual on the surface, catching up, asking about the shop building I had kept on Old Toxaway Road and was renting to a cabinet maker, asking about the Hollis Lake property. The lake house is a different matter. I need to tell you about the lake house separately because it is not just a piece of real estate in this story. Dorothy's parents had owned 40 acres on a private lake outside of Rosman, 12 minutes from our house in Brevard, since 1971. The cabin on it was built by her father Dale over 3 summers with the kind of patient, methodical craftsmanship that I recognized as a woodworker and respected in a way that went beyond the technical. When Dale died in 2012 and Dorothy inherited the property, neither of us ever seriously discussed selling it. We talked about updating the dock, which we did in 2016. We talked about replacing the roof, which I did myself in 2018 with Carter's help. A 3-day project that was one of the better weekends I can remember. The 2 of us on a roofline in October with the lake below us going copper in the afternoon light. Dorothy brought lunch both days and sat on the dock reading while we worked. And on the second evening after we finished, we built a fire and stayed until the temperature dropped, and Carter drove back to Asheville, and Dorothy and I sat in the dark listening to the water. That lake house is where Dorothy's family became my family. It is where my children became who they are. It is where Dorothy wanted her ashes scattered, which is where they are. When Carter started asking about the lake property in August, I noted it. When his girlfriend Dana mentioned in September, at a dinner I had driven to Asheville for, that the Lake District outside of Rosman was seeing serious interest from developers, and that the per-acre prices had moved significantly in the past 18 months, I noted that too. When Carter called the following week and mentioned a contact of his, a developer named Griffin who was doing a boutique project on private lake properties in the area and had expressed interest in having a conversation with me if I was ever open to it, I set the phone down after the call and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. 3 separate mentions in 60 days. A pattern does not need to be dramatic to be a pattern. It needs only to be consistent. I did not confront Carter. I did not mention what I was tracking. I went out to the back porch, the one Dorothy had insisted on adding in 2008 because she said we did not spend enough time outside doing nothing, and I sat in her chair, the green Adirondack that I had repainted twice since she died because she had liked that specific green and I was not going to let it fade, and I thought about what I actually needed to know. I did not want to run a test. I want to be clear about that the way I want to be clear about every decision in this story that could look calculated from the outside. What I wanted was what I had wanted since April 2021, which was a son who called because he missed talking to me, and not because he had a reason to. A son who asked about the lake house because he remembered the roof weekend, and not because he was positioning something. What I had was what I had, and before I responded to any of it, I needed to see the full shape of it clearly. The test I designed was simple. I called Carter on a Sunday afternoon and told him I had been thinking about the lake property, that the upkeep was getting to be a lot, that I had spoken informally with a realtor and the numbers were better than I had expected, and that I was not sure I needed a place that size now that it was just me. I said it matter-of-factly, the way a man says something he has been thinking about quietly and has now thought about enough to mention. Carter said before he said anything else, "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" Not, "Are you sure about this?" Not, "Dad, that place has been in Mom's family since before you and she met." Not, "What does Renee think?" Timeline. Not, time. The word arrived and I felt it land in the specific way that a word lands when it confirms something you were hoping was not true. I said I wasn't sure. He said Griffin, the developer contact, had mentioned that spring listings in that corridor moved faster than fall listings and that if I was seriously considering it, getting ahead of the season made financial sense. I said I would think about it. He said he could set up a call with Griffin any time, low pressure, just to understand the market. I said I appreciated it. We talked for a few more minutes about something else and ended the call. I sat on the back porch. The coffee went cold. A man spends 30 years building things with his hands and learns to read what is structurally sound and what is not, what will hold weight and what will fail under it. I had been reading my son's calls since July the way I read a piece of lumber, looking for the grain, looking for what was underneath the surface. What I found when I pressed on it was not what I had wanted to find. I called Renee that evening. Not to tell her everything. Not yet. Just to hear her voice and to ask, carefully, whether Carter had mentioned the lake property to her recently. She said no. She said she and Carter hadn't talked much since the summer. She said, "Dad, is something going on?" I said, "I was just thinking about things." She heard what was underneath that and did not press me, which was the right call, and which was one of the things that made her more like Dorothy than she probably knew. I called an attorney on Monday morning. Her name was Margaret Sutton, and she had an office on Main Street in Brevard that I had walked past 400 times in 30 years without ever having a reason to go into. I had a reason now. Margaret was 58, the kind of woman who had been practicing family estate law in a small mountain town long enough to have seen every version of every situation, and who communicated in complete sentences with no unnecessary words, which I respected immediately. She listened to me for 20 minutes. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Hollis, I have 2 questions. First, what does the current documentation on the lake property say, specifically regarding inheritance and transfer?" I told her the property was in Dorothy's estate, transferred to me at her death in 2021, currently held in my name, with no joint ownership designation and no formal estate plan attached to it, beyond the general will I had written in 2018. She said, "And the business sale proceeds. Are those in accounts separate from the real property assets?" They were. Dorothy and I had kept the business accounts distinct from the inherited property from the beginning, both for tax reasons and because Dorothy had said once, practically and without sentimentality, that what her father built should stay clearly separate from what we built, so neither one obscured the other. Margaret said, "Good. Second question. What outcome do you want not legally? In your family?" I had been sitting with that question since Sunday on the back porch with the cold coffee. I want to tell you what I had worked out, because the answer is the center of everything that follows. I did not want to punish Carter. I want to say that plainly and mean it, because the difference between not wanting to punish someone and not wanting there to be consequences is real, and it matters. I did not want to act from the part of me that was hurt and do something permanent while that part was still running the room. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the lake house protected from a transaction designed to extract value from it before I understood what I was agreeing to or who was benefiting from my agreement. I wanted Renee to know that what Dorothy's father had built was as much hers as her brother's. I wanted Carter to eventually sit in a room with me where we were not performing around something, where what was actually happening between us could be named. I told Margaret these things. She wrote more than I had seen a lawyer write at a first meeting. When she finished, she looked up and said, "The first thing I want to do is establish a formal property trust for the lake parcel, with independent trustee oversight and a co-trustee of your choosing. No sale without independent appraisal. No buyer connected to any family member or family member's professional contacts. No transaction involving any representative of Griffin or any associated development entity without co-trustee written consent. I can have the filing ready in 7 to 10 days. Do the lake house first," I said. The trust was filed on a Thursday. Dorothy's lake house, Dale's 40 acres, moved into a protected structure with Margaret as independent trustee and Renee as co-trustee. The terms were what I had asked for. Nothing could happen to that property without both of them approving it, and neither of them had an undisclosed financial interest in what happened to it. I drove out to the lake that evening after the filing, parked at the top of the path and walked down to the dock the way I had walked down to it for 22 years. The water was flat in the October cold. The maple at the east end of the dock that Dorothy had refused to let me cut down even when its roots were threatening the dockboards was going red in the way it went red every October, the specific red that Dorothy had a name for, a name she had gotten from her mother and that I had never remembered correctly, but had always loved hearing her say. I sat on the dock for an hour. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and quiet, and I felt Dorothy very specifically in the way I felt her when I was in a place she had loved, not as a presence exactly, but as an absence with a shape to it, the outline of a person in a space they used to fill. Carter called the following Friday to ask how I was doing. I said I was fine. He mentioned that Griffin had a window in November if I wanted to do a preliminary call. No pressure, just to understand the landscape. I said I was thinking it over. I said I wasn't sure the timing was right. He said, of course, no rush. The warmth in his voice was real, and it was also, I now understood, adjacent to something else that was not quite as real. And hearing those two things in the same tone from someone I had raised was a particular kind of difficult that I had not been prepared for. I called Renee the following Sunday and told her everything. The pattern since July, the Sunday call, the timeline question, Griffin, the filing. She was quiet through most of it. Not the silence of someone who is shocked, but the silence of someone who is carefully deciding what to do with what they have just received. When I finished, she said, "Dad, I didn't know any of this was happening." I said, "I know." I didn't want to say it until I knew what I was saying. She said, "Do you want me there when you talk to him?" I said, "Yes. Come for Thanksgiving. Be here when I tell him." She arrived Tuesday before Thanksgiving. We cooked together the way Dorothy had cooked, with the radio on and no plan that could not be adjusted, and we talked about her work and about the town, and about the maple at the east end of the dock that was almost bare now. On Thursday, Carter arrived at noon with Dana. He brought wine and the easy warmth he always brought and stood in Dorothy's kitchen that I had not changed in any significant way since she died and looked genuinely glad to be there, which he was. I believe he was genuinely glad to be there. That is the part of this that does not resolve neatly, that a person can be genuinely glad to be somewhere and also be moving towards something in that same place that they have not told you about. We ate. The conversation was the conversation of a family Thanksgiving, full and warm and carrying nothing heavy on the surface. After dinner, I said there was something I needed to tell them both. I said, "In October, I told Carter I was considering selling the lake house. I want to tell you both now that I was not seriously considering it. I was watching what happened when I said I might be." The table went quiet. Carter looked at me. His face did something in the 3 seconds after I said that which told me more than the July calls had told me, more than the timeline question on the Sunday phone call. The primary expression was not relief that the lake house was safe. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has had the board rearranged under him and is recalculating. I said, "Since July, you mentioned the lake property on 9 separate calls. Dana mentioned developer interest at dinner in September. You introduced a contact named Griffin and suggested a timeline based on seasonal listing patterns. That is not a casual conversation about real estate. That is a plan that is in motion." Carter said, "Dad, Griffin is just a contact. I was trying to be helpful." I said, "I know you were. I also know that helpful is sometimes what we call something when we want it to look different from what it is." He was quiet. Dana looked at the table. I said, "The lake house is in a trust filed 4 weeks ago. Margaret Sutton on Main Street. Renee is co-trustee. The terms make what Griffin was looking at impossible, not as a punishment, as a protection. Your grandfather, your mother's father, built that property over 3 summers. Your mother's ashes are in that lake. I am not selling it, and I am not signing anything that would move it toward being sold, and I need you to understand that this is not a negotiation." Carter said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't trying to push you into anything." I said, "I know you weren't trying to push me. That is the part I have been sitting with since October, because I believe you. I believe you thought you were helping. I also believe that Griffin had a financial interest in this conversation, and that you had a reason to want me moving in that direction, and that neither of those things got mentioned in any of the 9 calls." He looked at the table. The particular posture of a man who cannot disagree with the specific facts as they have been presented. Renee said quietly, from her side of the table, "Carter, what's actually going on with you?" There was a long pause. Dana put her hand on his arm. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at me, and what came across his face then was something I had not seen since he was much younger. A look I recognized from a boy who had gotten something wrong and was weighing whether to hold the line or let it down. He let it down. He said, "Griffin's project has a finder's fee structure for referrals, 15% of the acquisition price if a property closes through the contact chain. On a property like the lake house, in that corridor, at current per-acre prices, that number is significant." He paused. "Dana and I are trying to close on a building in the River Arts District, a mixed-use space. We've been working on it for a year. The financing gap is real, and it hasn't been moving, and Griffin came up in conversation when I was talking to a colleague, and the connection seemed like it could solve something that needed solving." The table was quiet. I said, "So it was not about me." He said, "It was not about you." I said, "You were going to help me sell Dorothy's family property to fund a real estate deal you had not told me you were trying to close." He did not answer that directly. He didn't need to. The silence answered it. I had known before Thanksgiving, sitting on the back porch with the cold coffee, that the timeline question on the Sunday call was not about my well-being. Hearing him say it plainly in Dorothy's dining room with Dorothy's good dishes on the table made it different. Not more true, it was already true. Just more real in the specific way that things become real when they are said in a place that matters rather than just understood in private. I looked at my son for a long time. Carter is 39 years old, and he has his mother's eyes in good light, and he was sitting across the table from me with the look of a man who had just dropped something heavy that he had been carrying in a way that hurt. I said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Did you need money, or did you want money? He thought about it. He said, I needed to believe I could close this deal. I don't know if that's the same thing. I said, what does the financing gap actually look like? He told me the number. Renee looked at me across the table. I looked at the number in my head and thought about what was realistic and what wasn't. Then Renee said, that is not an unsolvable number. Carter looked at his sister. She said, what you did was wrong. You went sideways at Dad instead of straight at him, and you pointed it at something that belongs to Mom, and you did it without telling any of us what was actually happening. That part is not okay, and I'm not going to pretend it is. She paused. And the number is still not unsolvable. I said, if you had called me in July and said, Dad, I am trying to close this deal and I have a real financing problem and I don't know how to ask you for help, what do you think I would have said? He was quiet. He said, I didn't think you would see it as me asking for help. I thought you would see it as me failing. I said, I am a man who borrowed more money than I had any right to borrow in 1989 to start a business in a rented unit with 2 employees and 1 table saw. When have I ever made you feel that needing help was failing? He didn't have an answer for that either. But I watched something in his face change when I said it. Something shift from the held back to the honest. And that shift was what I had been waiting for since Sunday in October, when I sat on the back porch with the cold coffee and understood that the conversation I needed to have with my son was not about real estate. We stayed at the table until past 7. The conversation moved the way honest conversations move when the thing underneath has finally been named, which is slowly at first and then with increasing ease, like a door that has been stuck and then is not stuck anymore. Carter and Renee talked about the building project with the directness of a brother and sister who had decided to be in the same room with a true thing rather than around it. Dana, to her credit, said twice that she had not fully understood what Carter had been doing, and that if she had, she would have told him it was the wrong approach, and I believed her. I made coffee at 8 because Dorothy had always made coffee at 8 when there were people at the table and the conversation was not done. I put 4 cups out. We drank it and talked about less difficult things, and by the time Carter and Dana left at 9:30, the room had lost most of what it had been carrying. Carter hugged me at the door. A long hold. The real kind. The kind that comes from a man who is not performing. I held him back. I did not say everything was fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and he knew it and I knew it, and some things need to be said accurately, even in a hug. What I said was, your mother would have asked you in July. He pulled back and looked at me. He said, I know she would have. I said, she would have asked you because she knew you. She knew that you turn away from the thing when you're afraid of how it looks and that the turning away costs more than the asking would have. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she told me that once, that I made problems into projects when I should have been making them into conversations. I forgot. Come back in the spring, I said. We'll open the lake house. He nodded. We'll figure out the rest. I watched his taillights go down the drive and then stood on the front porch in the November cold, until the cold reminded me that I was 64 years old and had been standing in it without thinking about it, which is either wisdom or stubbornness, and I have never been fully clear on the difference. I went inside. I watered Dorothy's plants, the 2 she had kept on the kitchen sill that I had managed to keep alive through 2.5 years of learning what she had known without effort. I sat in the green Adirondack I had moved to the back porch because she had liked sitting in it and I was not going to put it in storage. Renee came and sat across from me. She had her phone in her hand and she turned it toward me, and I saw on the screen a photograph I did not immediately recognize. A photograph of a handwritten list in Dorothy's specific print lettering, organized the way she organized everything, with a header that read New Zealand, What We Do First, and a date from 2019. I looked at it for a long time. First draft, I said. Was she revising it? Renee said, I found it in her desk when I cleaned out the study. There were 2 more behind it. The second one had a circled note in the margin that said, make Ray confirm his passport before we buy anything. I looked at my daughter. She was smiling the way her mother smiled. I said, my passport is current. She said, I already looked at spring departures. I sat in Dorothy's chair on the back porch in November, with the lake somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line and Dorothy's plans in 3 drafts on a phone screen, and I thought about a woman who had written an itinerary she did not get to use, and raised two children who were, in the full, honest accounting, doing their best with what they had been given, which was imperfect and human and still more than enough to work with. The lake house was protected. The record was honest. And somewhere in Renee's phone, in the margins of a second draft of a trip that had not yet happened, Dorothy had already told me to confirm my passport. I should have done it sooner. I'm doing it now. If this story reached something in you, drop a comment and tell me which moment landed hardest. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you aren't here yet. And if you have been turning a problem into a project when you should have been turning it into a conversation, let me tell you what Dorothy would have said. Ask for what you need. Say it to the person. Say it directly. It costs less than the other way. It always does.